The Arizona Territory had a way of swallowing dreams. The wind never stopped blowing across its endless stretches of red earth, carrying dust through abandoned wagon tracks and around lonely cabins scattered miles apart. Out here, survival was measured one sunrise at a time, and mercy was as rare as rain. Clara Whitmore understood that better than anyone. Every morning before dawn, she stepped onto the porch of her weathered homestead, wrapped in a faded shawl against the desert chill. She would pause for a moment, staring across the silent valley where the first rays of sunlight painted the mesas in shades of crimson and gold. It was beautiful, painfully beautiful, but beauty meant little when there was no one left to share it with. 3 years earlier, her husband, Thomas, had ridden into town with a wagon full of leather goods to sell. He never came home. Bandits had ambushed the stagecoach on the old Tucson road, killing every passenger before vanishing into the desert. The following winter had stolen the last piece of her heart. Her infant daughter, Emma, caught a fever that no doctor could cure. Clara had spent endless nights holding the child close beside the fireplace, praying for a miracle that never came. By spring, the tiny grave behind the cabin stood beside Thomas's wooden cross, overlooking the valley they had once dreamed of calling home. Many would have left. Clara stayed, not because she loved the land anymore, but because it was the only place where the memories of her family still breathed. She survived by repairing saddles, stitching torn harnesses, and growing what little food the stubborn desert soil allowed. Ranchers passed through from time to time, tossing a few coins onto her workbench before riding away without much conversation. In the nearby settlement of Dry Creek, whispers followed her wherever she went. Poor Clara. Nothing but bad luck. Some folks bring misfortune with them. She had stopped caring what they believed. Loneliness was quieter than gossip. One late October afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the distant mountains as Clara ventured into Black Rock Canyon to collect firewood before the coming storm. The canyon walls rose high above her, casting long shadows across the narrow trail. She had nearly filled her bundle when the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the rocks. 2 rough-looking horse thieves emerged around the bend. Their faces were hidden beneath dusty hats, revolvers resting loosely at their sides. "Afternoon," one of them said with a crooked grin. Clara tightened her grip on the bundle of wood. "We heard you've got money hidden on that little ranch of yours." "I have nothing worth stealing," the taller outlaw laughed. "Then you won't mind if we come take a look." The men dismounted slowly. Clara stepped backward until her shoulders touched the canyon wall. There was nowhere left to run. The shorter man reached for her arm. Then, thunk! An arrow buried itself in the dirt, barely inches from his boot. The outlaw froze. A second arrow struck the canyon wall beside his head. Silence followed. Slowly, a lone figure stepped from the shadows, atop a ridge overlooking the trail. He wore worn buckskin clothing that blended into the stone itself, his long black hair tied behind his shoulders. A bow rested calmly in his hands, another arrow already drawn. His dark eyes never wavered. The taller outlaw swallowed hard. Neither thief waited for another warning. They scrambled onto their horses and galloped from the canyon, disappearing into a cloud of dust. The stranger lowered his bow, but remained where he stood. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he descended the rocky slope with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to the land itself. Stopping several feet away, he looked at Clara. "Are you hurt?" His English carried a soft accent, but was clear. She shook her head. "No." He nodded once. Good. That was all. No request for thanks, no boast about what he had done. He simply turned toward the western trail. "Wait," Clara called. He paused. "I never learned your name." Without looking back, he answered quietly, "Taza." Then he disappeared among the towering rocks as silently as he had arrived. The storm arrived before sunset. Wind battered Clara's cabin through the night, tearing loose sections of her old livestock fence. By morning, exhaustion hung over the ranch. She sighed as she carried a hammer toward the damaged pasture. Then she stopped. Someone had already repaired it. Every broken post stood straight. Fresh ropes secured each rail with practiced precision. There were footprints in the soft earth, but no horse tracks. Only one person could have crossed the rocky hills on foot so effortlessly. 2 mornings later, she discovered another surprise. A full barrel of fresh water rested beside her porch. The nearest spring lay nearly 5 miles away. No ordinary traveler would have made such a journey without expecting payment. Days became weeks. Small acts of kindness appeared without explanation. Firewood stacked neatly beside the cabin. A trapped calf, carefully freed from tangled brush. Clean cloth left outside her door. Whoever helped her never asked for recognition. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped below the mesas, Clara finally saw him again. Taza stood near the edge of her property, watching the horizon rather than the house. This time, instead of keeping her distance, she walked toward him. "I've been looking for the man who's been helping me," she said. He gave the faintest hint of a smile. "You found him. You could have simply knocked on the door." He looked toward the fading sunlight. "Many doors have never opened for my people." Clara fell silent. She realized then how much fear and suspicion had shaped the lives of both of them. After a long pause, she held out a small cloth bundle. "I baked bread this morning." Taza looked at it, then at her. "I have nothing to trade." "It's not a trade." For the first time in years, Clara saw something softer than caution in another person's eyes. He accepted the bread with quiet gratitude. As the desert sky filled with the colors of dusk, 2 lonely souls, separated by culture, grief, and the harshness of the frontier, stood together in silence. Neither of them knew it yet, but this simple act of kindness marked the beginning of a bond that would challenge every prejudice the frontier had ever known. Winter settled gently over the Arizona territory. There was no blanket of snow across the desert, only crisp mornings, icy nights, and a sky so clear that every star seemed close enough to touch. The harsh heat retreated, leaving the land quiet, almost peaceful. For Clara Whitmore and Taza, that peace became the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Their meetings were never planned. Some mornings, Clara would find fresh rabbit tracks leading toward the hills, and by afternoon, Taza would appear, carrying game for them to share. Other days, she would see him repairing a broken corral post before vanishing into the mesquite trees without saying a word. Eventually, silence gave way to conversation. They would sit outside her cabin after sunset, sharing coffee brewed over the fire, while coyotes called across the distant valley. Clara discovered that Taza had once belonged to a thriving Apache band that lived deep within the mountains. As a young warrior, he had dreamed only of protecting his family and honoring his ancestors. Those dreams had ended in smoke. Years earlier, soldiers had swept through their village, believing they were sheltering raiders. The attack came before dawn. Homes burned, horses scattered into the wilderness, and families fled in every direction. Taza had survived, but many of the people he loved had not. Since then, he had wandered the frontier alone, avoiding settlements that judged him before hearing his name. Clara listened without interruption. When he finished, she stared into the glowing fire. "I thought I was the only one who carried ghosts," she whispered. Taza looked toward the 2 wooden crosses standing behind the cabin. "We both do." From that night on, neither of them had to carry those ghosts alone. As the weeks passed, they began teaching one another the skills that had shaped their different worlds. Clara spread old books across her kitchen table, patiently helping Taza sound out English words. At first, he stumbled over the letters, but he refused to give up. "You learn quickly," she said one evening. He smiled faintly. "A warrior learns to watch before he acts." In return, Taza introduced Clara to the hidden language of the desert. He showed her how certain birds circled above distant water. He pointed out edible cactus fruit hidden among sharp spines, and taught her to read animal tracks pressed into dry earth, as if they were words written across the land. "The desert speaks," he told her. "Most people are simply too loud to hear it." For the first time since Thomas had died, Clara laughed. It was a quiet laugh, but it echoed through the valley like the return of spring. Not everyone welcomed the change. One afternoon, Clara rode into Dry Creek to buy flour and lamp oil. Conversation stopped the moment she entered the general store. Eyes followed her from every corner. Hargrove leaned toward another customer and whispered just loudly enough to be heard, "That's the woman who's been entertaining an Apache." Another man shook his head. "Won't end well." Clara ignored them and paid for her supplies. As she stepped outside, Sheriff Eli Morgan approached. He removed his hat politely, but wore a troubled expression. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "folks are talking. They've always talked. This is different. They're afraid. They're angry." Clara met his gaze. Should kindness make people angry? The sheriff hesitated. No, but fear often does. Among those watching her was Silas Crowley. Crowley owned the largest cattle ranch for 50 miles and believed everything in the valley should belong to him, including Clara's homestead. Her land sat beside the only dependable spring within several miles, making it invaluable during dry seasons. For years he had offered to buy it. For years she had refused. Now he saw an opportunity. Inside the saloon that evening, Crowley stood before a crowd of ranch hands. "That Apache isn't visiting her by accident," he declared. "They're scouting our ranches." Someone asked if he had proof. Crowley smiled coldly. "By the time you have proof, your cattle will already be gone." Fear spread through the room faster than whiskey. By sunrise, rumors had become accepted truth. 3 nights later, Clara awoke to the frantic cries of her horses. She rushed outside. Flames climbed the walls of her barn, lighting the darkness with terrifying brilliance. She grabbed buckets of water, desperately throwing them against the fire, but the dry timber burned too quickly. Hoofbeats thundered into the distance. By dawn, little remained except blackened beams and drifting smoke. 2 of her horses were gone. So were her winter supplies. When Sheriff Morgan arrived, he examined the ashes silently. "You know who did this," Clara said. He sighed. "I know who I suspect." "Then arrest him." "I can't." "Why?" "Because no one here will testify against Silas Crowley." That evening, Taza returned from hunting and found Clara sitting alone beside the ruins of her barn. She tried to smile. It didn't last. "I bring trouble wherever I go," he said quietly. "Greedy men bring trouble." He stared across the valley for a long time. Then he spoke the words she feared most. "If I leave, Crowley will stop." She stood immediately. "No. My people have survived I disappearing. I've survived enough goodbyes." But Taza had already made up his mind. Before sunrise, he saddled his horse and prepared to ride toward the mountains, believing that sacrificing his own happiness was the only way to protect hers. As he reached the edge of the property, Clara ran after him. "Taza!" He stopped but did not turn around. She caught up, breathing hard. "If you leave now," she said, tears filling her eyes, "then Crowley wins." For a long moment the desert was silent, except for the whisper of the wind. Slowly Taza faced her. There was no fear in his eyes, only love. He stepped closer until only a single breath separated them. Then, in a voice so gentle it was almost carried away by the morning breeze, he whispered, "Marry me, and you'll never face the frontier alone again." Clara looked into the eyes of the man the frontier had taught her to fear. Instead, she saw loyalty, honor, and a future she thought had died years ago. A smile, small but certain, crossed her face. "I've been alone long enough," she whispered. Beneath the first light of dawn, they embraced, unaware that their decision would soon ignite the greatest challenge either of them had ever faced. The sun rose over the Arizona Territory, with the quiet certainty it always had. As if it knew nothing of hatred, fear, or the lines people drew between one another. Yet beneath its golden light, Clara Whitmore and Taza stood beneath an ancient grove of cottonwood trees, beside a narrow spring, preparing to make a promise that neither war nor prejudice could break. There was no grand church, no polished wooden pews, no crowd of cheering guests. Only the whisper of the wind through the leaves, the gentle murmur of flowing water, and an elderly Apache medicine woman named Ayanna, who had traveled for 2 days after receiving Taza's message. Clara wore the simple cream-colored dress she had sewn years before, hoping one day to celebrate a happier future. Taza stood beside her in traditional buckskin clothing, decorated with hand-stitched beadwork that had belonged to his late father. Ayanna smiled warmly at them both. "In every land," she said softly, "the strongest home is built not from wood or stone, but from trust." Instead of exchanging rings, they exchanged small leather cords braided from horsehair, a symbol of 2 separate paths becoming one. As they tied the cords around each other's wrists, the old woman raised her hands toward the endless desert sky. "The Creator has watched 2 lonely hearts find one another. May they walk as one until the trail ends." When the ceremony was over, Taza gently took Clara's hand. For the first time in many years, she no longer felt like the last survivor of a forgotten dream. She had found a new beginning. News of their marriage spread across Dry Creek, faster than a summer wildfire. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered that Clara had betrayed her own people. But not everyone believed the rumors. Sheriff Eli Morgan had watched Silas Crowley manipulate the town for years. He had remained silent too often, telling himself there was never enough evidence to stand against the wealthy cattle baron. Now, seeing Crowley's growing anger, he realized silence had become another form of cowardice. Meanwhile, Crowley gathered a dozen armed riders outside his ranch house. "They think marriage changes anything," he sneered. "By tomorrow morning, that ranch will belong to me." The men mounted their horses and rode toward Clara's homestead beneath the cover of darkness. Taza had expected the attack. He knew Crowley too well to believe the man would simply walk away. Instead of preparing for a bloody fight, he prepared to outthink his enemy. Together, he and Clara spent 2 days quietly transforming the ranch into a maze of clever defenses. Loose rocks were positioned high along narrow trails. Hidden ropes were stretched across small gullies. Lanterns were placed in empty fields to create the illusion that armed defenders waited in every direction. When Crowley's riders arrived before dawn, confusion spread through their ranks almost immediately. One horse stumbled over a hidden rope, throwing its rider harmlessly into the sand. Another group chased flickering lantern light, believing they were pursuing Taza, only to find themselves trapped inside a dry wash with no clear escape. No bullets were fired, no lives were taken. The desert itself became Taza's greatest ally. Watching from a rocky ridge, Clara admired the calm confidence with which her husband protected their home. He had once told her that true strength was measured not by how many enemies a warrior defeated, but by how many lives he spared. Now she understood exactly what he meant. As daylight spread across the valley, Sheriff Morgan arrived with several deputies. Behind him rode a handful of ranchers who had finally grown tired of Crowley's lies. One by one, Crowley's own hired men lowered their rifles. They had expected a battle against dangerous outlaws. Instead, they found a husband defending his wife without shedding unnecessary blood. One nervous rider finally spoke. "Crowley paid us to burn her place." Another nodded. He said the Apache planned to attack every ranch in the valley. It wasn't true. The truth poured out all at once. Years of cattle theft, false accusations, intimidation, even evidence linking Crowley to the stagecoach robbery that had claimed Thomas Whitmore's life years earlier. Sheriff Morgan stepped forward. "Silas Crowley," he announced firmly, "you're under arrest." For the first time anyone could remember, the powerful rancher had nothing left to say. He surrendered without a fight. Seasons came and went. The scars of the past never disappeared completely, but they no longer controlled the future. Clara and Taza rebuilt the barns stronger than before. Together they transformed their homestead into a welcoming stop for travelers crossing the territory. No one was turned away. A thirsty ranch hand received water. A lost trader found shelter. Apache families traveling through the valley shared meals beside settlers who, only a few years earlier, would never have imagined sitting around the same fire. Children laughed together without caring where one family came from or what language another spoke. The valley slowly became known not for conflict but for cooperation. Years later, on a peaceful spring morning, Clara stood on the porch, watching Taza teach their young son how to ride across the open prairie. The boy's laughter drifted through the warm breeze. It sounded like hope. A traveler passing through paused beside the fence. "They say you trusted an Apache when everyone else feared him," the man said. Clara smiled as she watched her husband lift their son back into the saddle after a clumsy fall. "I didn't trust him because he was Apache," she replied. "I trusted him because every promise he ever made, he kept." The traveler looked toward the family riding beneath the endless western sky. What was the promise? Clara's eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She remembered that cold desert morning when Taza had almost ridden away forever. She remembered the words that changed her life. With a gentle smile, she answered. He whispered, "Marry me, and you'll never face the frontier alone again." She glanced toward the horizon, where her husband and son rode beneath the golden light of the setting sun. "And after all these years," she said softly, "I never did." The wind carried her words across the valley, leaving behind not the echo of loneliness, but the enduring promise of love, courage, and two hearts that had found a home in each other on the untamed American frontier.